In today's podcast interview, I interview leading researcher on blood flow restriction training, Dr. Jeremy Loenneke. Dr. Loenneke is known for his work on blood flow restriction training, particularly practical blood flow restriction training. In today's interview, we're going to dive in deep into the different studies he's done, the things he's learned, and the best practices he has to share. All right, everybody, we're here with Dr. Jeremy Loenneke, the lead researcher on blood flow restriction training. Welcome, doctor.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the best way I like to start with these podcasts is really kind of diving into kind of the background of the person we're interviewing. So could you tell the audience a little bit about your background?
Sure. I'm in my fourth year as an assistant professor at Ole Miss. University of Mississippi. Before then, I did my PhD at Oklahoma. I did my undergraduate and master's work at Southeast Missouri State. I've kind of been into sports most of my life. I dabbled in bodybuilding and powerlifting. Was very mediocre, to say the least. But I did enjoy it. I did spend several years doing that. But kind of was always into trying to figure out how to get bigger, how to get stronger. And that's kind of what led to just kind of my emphasis on studying skeletal muscle.
Nice. That's awesome. And so how many studies have you done so far on blood flow restriction training?
I don't know, a lot. We've been probably studying this for about a decade. So, we do other things as well, but a large focus of our work is blood flow restriction for sure.
And why blood flow restriction? How did you stumble into that particular field?
Yeah, I did my internship for my undergraduate work up at the University of Illinois with Dr. Huey. And before I went up there, I was always kind of reading a little bit of literature, but I was an undergraduate, so I was never quite certain, what I was actually reading. But I came across a paper on blood flow restriction, but I wasn't. It just seemed to me that probably didn't make sense. So I probably was just missing something. So I didn't think anything much more of it. But when I went to Illinois, while I was working in that lab, I was working out at Gold's Gym in Champaign. And, the other people that worked out there were the likes of Lane Norton, Chris Foz. So I really started to kind of mingle with those guys. And they were kind of throwing around this idea of trying to figure out how to do blood flow restriction. And so then I started to kind of put the two and two together. I'm like, well, maybe there is something to this. I must admit that my first thought was that this is ridiculous. There's no way that this makes any sense. But to me, that's always something you should be very skeptical at first, especially when someone says you restrict blood flow and that's going to be something beneficial. But I started reading a lot more about it. Then went back to my Southeast Missouri State for my master's, and I started to kind of do some of the work on blood flow restriction. So that's kind of how it started.
That's great. Yeah, I had kind of a similar experience. I first saw it years ago in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning from the National Strength and Conditioning Association. And I thought it was very counterintuitive because I thought, up until that point that, blood flow was essential for building strength and that, you would never want to restrict blood flow during exercise. So that's what kind of piqued my interest and got me really into the field. So it sounds kind of similar in your case where you were kind of skeptical at first.
Yeah, certainly.
So that's cool. So when you got into these studies, a lot of the studies were on practical blood flow restriction, correct?
Yeah, that's, we kind of proposed that model, I suppose, probably about 10 years ago. Me and Dr. Pujol from Southeast Missouri State. And we were just trying to figure out, it's a really good school, but it's not a research school per se. But we were trying to figure out kind of how could we do something with this. And I kind of looked around and kind of with some of my interactions up when I was at Illinois, kind of with this NERAP model. So we started doing some work with that. We proposed that model in Strength and Conditioning Journal. I think it got published 2008 or 2009. Then we started doing some very acute work. So just to see, does it kind of, in the short term, mimic what happens with more expensive equipment? So we were kind of messing around with that. And then other people kind of ran with that a little bit and did some training studies and showed that it seemed like it was doing something. beneficial. So yeah, it was very much early on the practical restriction, which obviously has a lot of limitations, no question. But I think for most people, everyday gym goers, it's probably good enough. Not perfect, certainly, but probably good enough.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that I've always been of the same belief, obviously, that you know, most people are not going to have access to the expensive devices, and like you said, it's going to be good enough for them to be able to get the results that they want in the gym. Given unless somebody has a specific outcome they're looking for rehab or something of that effect, then of course they'd want to go see a specialist and maybe use some of the more expensive equipment. But for somebody who's looking to get lean and tone and healthy and gain some muscle, that the practical BFR can be effective, correct?
Yeah, and like I've said this multiple times, I think that you certainly don't have to do blood flow restriction ever to see optimal changes in muscle size and strength. I don't even like the word optimal, but it gets thrown around so much that but you don't need blood flow restriction to maximize gains. But with that being said, it is a tool that could be probably used to help if you choose. So yeah, I think that blood flow restriction, especially with the practical model, has some utility for the everyday gym goer. Um, just bearing in mind the limitations that go along with that.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, I always tell people that there's no panacea to health, and that anytime you're using a tool, that you have to look at it as a tool, as part of your tool belt, and that no one thing is going to get you all the results. It's about periodization, it's about progression, and I think BFR, when integrated properly, can be a really really valuable tool. I think that some of the studies, it might have been some of your studies, that you guys found that it works best as a bolt-on, like if you're doing traditional heavy training and then also kind of doing BFR as like a finisher or on other days of the week.
That has been shown, not by us, but it has been shown by some people kind of working with some Division One American football players, that has been shown to have some utility there. So, and I think that that has to be kept in context, certainly, as you kind of mentioned. If you're going in there and you're doing multiple exercises, multiple sets, you're probably not getting much more out of the blood flow restriction. I mean, a muscle is only going to respond so much,
Mm-hmm.
but it certainly has shown to be somewhat beneficial when added to the end of a workout, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, I could see it being really valuable when you're using it as part of a kind of a holistic program. If you're doing your traditional training and you're also using this as an add-on or as one of your many tools to see results, I could see this obviously being really really valuable. As a standalone, probably not going to get you to look like to go from a skinny Joe to being like Ronnie Coleman. I don't think it would do that by itself. Correct?
Yeah, I think you'd have to really pick your parents carefully in order for that.
Yeah. Exactly, exactly. As a standalone, probably maybe more so for recovery, or in my case, I really like to use it maybe for like active recovery or a deload week to help kind of undulate the periodization. So I'm not every week just constantly trying to go heavier and heavier and heavier week after week. I like to kind of undulate that periodization. So I see it valuable maybe as a standalone for an active recovery period. From that standpoint, but I think for my case, I personally like to use it as a bolt on, either on other days of the week or at the end of a traditional workout. Now, what do
Yeah.
you see in terms of like cardio? A lot of people ask, can I use this? Can I put it on my legs and do some light cardio? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that evidence is certainly mixed. And it's not more of it's the muscle stuff is more of a focus of ours, but there has been work done on that shows some benefit. I think it'd be small at best, to be honest. I do think that I could see where people could make an argument for using it sometimes, to help with, angiogenesis or whatever, to help it increase blood flow. But I think that, I think that it's weak at best for that. I think you need to maybe something a little bit stronger for most people. If you have somebody who's a little bit deconditioned, then
Hmm.
maybe that's something. But I think if you are using this as kind of a sole focus to increase cardiorespiratory fitness, I would
Hmm.
say that you're probably going to be disappointed.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that if you use it by itself, unless, like you said, unless somebody's kind of new and they're a beginner, they're going to see, some general adaptations, and this could be useful. But if somebody's already been working out, if you're a gym goer and this is the only thing you do for cardio, probably not going to amplify that cardio much more. But my question is more around if you use this integrated, because my whole thing with BFR is all about how do I integrate this into the type of training or the type of variations of training that I'm already planning into my protocol. If I'm already creating a periodization where every, let's say, 90 days I'm going into kind of a new phase or a new style of training, and I integrate this in, what would be the best way to integrate it? Would it just be with just strength training only, or is there a way to use it with cardio?
Yeah, I think that for most people, if you're wanting to see, especially muscle level adaptations, I mean, you could put it in there if you have, for whatever reason, you can't lift weights. I think that makes some sense. Typically the way we talk about, blood flow restriction is, if you can't do anything, there is some data, not very much of it, that if you just apply blood flow restriction, you're able to slow down the loss of muscle, which could be, beneficial following surgery. But as soon as you can start doing something, maybe walking with it, maybe that could help maintain some of that, if not maybe increase it in certain populations. But when we talk about, increasing muscle size similar to that of high load exercise, that's coming from low load exercise with weights. So resistance exercise. So I don't want to tell people not to ever do it with cardio, but
Mm-hmm.
I think that you certainly could. But I think that if you, the maximal stimulus is it's definitely with low load exercise with blood flow restriction.
Okay, got it. So it seems like the primary, benefits come from doing the low load strength training, but it could be used for cardio as well if people wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly could, yes.
Okay, great, great. And in your studies, what were some of the biggest findings you had? What were some of the most surprising things you discovered?
Um, yeah, good question. I think the um, I think a big focus of ours has been methodology and safety. I think early on, I kind of had an idea that maybe there was something very special about certain um, devices that we would use. Maybe we use one device and everybody else was using a different one. And I kind of had this idea that there's something special about each device. And I've started to think that's probably not the case. I think you need to keep in mind the cuff you're applying, the size of the limb to which you're applying it to, how wide is the cuff. But I don't think that there's a lot of people who have started businesses with blood flow restriction, and all of that's great. But I think that is there anything special, inherently special about each device? Probably not. I think there's some devices that have unique features for sure, but I think it comes down to the size of the cuff. What pressure are you using to apply? So that's been probably one of the early things because when you start you're a doctor, you kind of have some thoughts of like, oh, this is it. There's something special about this device
Yeah,
that
exactly.
just didn't pan out. So I think that one. I think another kind of idea that I wouldn't say it has completely been written off, but my thoughts on it have changed a lot. Is I used to think that there was something really special about like something anabolic about these buildup of metabolites, meaning that when we pull these metabolites inside of the muscle, that in itself is playing a really important role with augmenting muscle size. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that. I think what it's probably doing is it is important to pull those metabolites, but it's basically fatiguing the fibers and augmenting muscle activation. So I think it's working by augmenting how hard the muscle's working, not just the pulling of the metabolites in and of themselves, which was a little bit different than what I thought originally. So I would say those uh, kind of two broad areas.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. I was kind of the same belief that that there's a lot of devices out there that can be used for this, but at the end of the day, they're all doing the same thing, which is providing pressure on the limb. And like you said, everyone's going to have to find the right fit for them, depending on their on their size and circumference of their limbs and that thing. They're going to have to find what fits them best and works for them best. But they're all providing pressure to the limb, And if you're doing it correctly, like you said, there's nothing necessarily extremely special about one expensive device or one lesser expensive device. So
Right.
it's about doing the doing the training correctly, performing the the occlusion training correctly, and not applying too little or too much pressure, and doing it for like the direct correct duration and things like that. So I'm definitely of the same mindset. One of the things I thought that was interesting is, kind of like what you're talking about is, there's a lot of theories around how does it work, how does it get results, and I haven't really seen any studies done yet, really kind of on the neurological aspects of it, because a lot of my background is in studying the neuroscience of exercise and looking at things like, for example, one of my theories is that it's reducing kind of neurological threat against strength. So for instance, if I don't have good mapping, somatosensory mapping of my shoulder in a certain plane, then when I do a heavy shoulder press, my brain might kick in that brain safety switch. The amygdala is then going to limit my strength in that movement. And I think part of how the occlusion training is probably working is by stimulating those pressure receptors, those baroreceptors, and those mechanoreceptors, those stretch receptors. You're providing input to the brain, which is probably improving that map clarity, improving the somatosensory map, so you can contract the muscle a little bit better. Probably even improving that contractile map to a certain degree, so that you can move better, which it probably leads to decreased neural threat, which leads to enhanced performance, enhanced strength.
Yeah, no, I don't know about any of that, to be honest, but I do think that I'd have to agree with you that we probably should be focusing, and I think that some people are starting to focus more on the neural aspect. I think that, and most people would disagree with us on this, and that's okay. But I do think that for a long time, we kind of discussed the strength change as being driven by the change in muscle size. And I don't think that there's any evidence for that. And we're starting to think about the exact opposite. It doesn't mean that it's only the nervous system or that there's nothing at the muscle level itself that's changing. But I do think that you're onto something with that. What's going on with the nervous system? How is that interacting to increase strength? I think that that's a really good point for sure. And I do think that, I have seen some work done on that, but I think we need a lot more, certainly. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, that's just been that's the thing I've been talking about for the last several years, and a lot of the things I've been writing and speaking about is really my perspective on strength. My whole new paradigm on strength is looking at it through a neurological lens, rather than the whole fitness industry, even all the major certifications for trainers and such that are all out there, they're all saying the same thing. They're stuck in a paradigm that, fitness is very biomechanical. And biomechanics, like you said, is important. Physiology is important. It all plays a role. But in my viewpoint, you have 11 different systems, and the nervous system is like the CEO of the other systems. It's the brain is the CEO of the body, telling the other ones what to do. And so I look at it as, when I'm doing a certain activity or a certain exercise, I'm looking at it from a viewpoint of how does this impact the brain, which is going to impact the body, rather than how does this directly locally impact the body to get a change in the body. And I think that, you hear this big term out there used a lot now called biohacking. A lot of people are trying to figure out, how do I biohack this? How do I biohack that? And I think if the goal is to biohack, which in my opinion is really just trying to find that one lever that's going to, strategically be placed to move the whole mountain to get results a little bit more efficiently, to get results smarter, then you have to look at things from a neurological viewpoint. How am I going to affect the brain? And so, yeah, I see a lot of interesting things that will be coming about in the next few years, I think, around things like vision training for performance, for strength, or for speed, or for endurance, and vestibular training for strength and performance, and blood flow restriction training. Because, a lot of the analogy I always use is like your brain is like the GPS of a car, and the GPS wants to create a clear map of where the car is relative to space and time. But that GPS needs information from different satellites. And in your body's case, you have 3 different satellites. You have proprioception, which is what most of the fitness industry is focused on. That's the body's nerve endings. That's the body. But you also have vision and vestibular, and those are faster information sources. And people in the fitness industry never really talk about that. You go to like Roadrunner Sports, what do? They put you on a treadmill, they analyze your gait, they look at your foot, and they give you some inserts to help improve your speed, but they don't look at your vision or peripheral vision, which could be the one thing that's slowing that person down. So I find it really fascinating that that the fitness industry is is going in this direction potentially of integrating neuroscience, and I think it'll be much more not only effective, but it'll also help prevent injuries and help people get results a little bit faster.
Yeah, I think that's interesting.
So, what were some of the main things you found were most essential to the proper setup, in your studies when you're doing this practical BFR? What were, if you were to say the key things that you had to ensure for proper setup of the exercise to execute it correctly? What were those key things?
With blood flow restriction and just like applying it,
Yep.
yeah, I think that the number one thing is to set the pressure relative to the person. And if you have equipment, that's very easy to do. So, meaning that, the way we do it and the way a lot of people are starting to do it is to set the pressure relative to the resting arterial occlusion pressure. Meaning, arterial occlusion pressure is essentially the lowest pressure that is applied where you have no blood flow at all to the limb. So, in other words, what we do is whatever cuff we're going to use for blood flow restriction, we place that cuff on top of the limb, and then we go distal to that, and we slowly increase the pressure until we cut it off completely. And let's just say that's 100 millimeters of mercury. Then we apply a pressure relative to that, right? So we typically apply around 40% of arterial occlusion, 40 to 80%. So the lowest pressure we'd apply in that situation is about 40 millimeters of mercury. So I think that's key, and I think that's the only way that we're ever going to be able to really move this into clinical settings so we can have some type of standardization. Otherwise, oftentimes, especially the old literature, it would apply the same pressure to everyone, and that's a big problem because the size of the limb, the cuff size that you're using, meaning that the wider the cuff gets, the lower pressure you need to use to cut off blood flow. So if you read an old study that was using a narrow cuff and you go, oh, they use 200 millimeters of mercury, I'm going to use 200 millimeters of mercury, but you're using a wide cuff. Well, that's going to be a completely different stimulus, and you could account for all of it by just setting it relative to the resting arterial occlusion pressure. So I think the issue is that I think the argument for some people is, well, who cares? Because a lot of the old studies never set the pressure relative to the person, and there's plenty of adaptation occurring. They never didn't see adaptation. So I think that's a reasonable point, but I think the counter to that is I don't think it's necessarily an adaptation thing. I think it's a safety thing, because we know that if you apply a higher relative pressure, there's an augmented cardiovascular response. So I think that, yeah, maybe you could apply a random pressure to most people, and most people are going to see beneficial changes. But the cardiovascular or the safety component is elevated at higher pressures. So for most people, most of your listeners, it's probably not a big deal. If you're healthy, it doesn't matter if you have an augmented cardiovascular response, because they all come back to baseline, everything's fine. But for people who are in clinical settings or things like that, having an augmented cardiovascular response, meaning that your blood pressure increases way more than it would at a lower pressure, but yet you get the same muscle adaptation, that might be a big concern for them. So I think that setting the pressure relative to that limb, meaning that a lot of people will take blood pressure at the arm and then use that to set pressure relative to the lower body. And my thing is, just put the cuff on the lower body and take the pressure of the limb. Then you account for everything. So to me, that's the easiest way. It's not that, and a lot of people talk in the literature about, well, that's a very complicated process to set. It's not. It's like taking blood pressure of the limb. If you have a Doppler probe, which, it's not cheap, but, you're essentially taking the pulse of your wrist. So if you put the cuff on your arm, you take the pulse at your wrist. If it's no longer there, well, that's arterial occlusion. That would be the cheapest way to do it.
Got it. So they could do that to establish their personal baseline in a practical way. And then from there, they could say, okay, I'm going to go at like 40% of that. What would be a practical way to measure it, let's say with like perceived tightness, or are there other practical ways for somebody to tighten something to their upper arm or upper leg without having some expensive equipment or Doppler besides that?
It's a really good question. We literally just finished a study kind of looking at how well people can perceive pressure. I don't know those results off the top of my head. We haven't run them yet, but what my guess would be, just based on what I've seen, uh, is that I think that most people, the popular thing is to set it relative to 7 out of 10 on a tightness scale, meaning that 10 is super tight. We want you to set this as a 7. I think that's become very popular. That was something that we proposed on a paper several years ago. Now, I think for most people that's probably works, meaning that when they say it's a 7 out of 10, that's below arterial occlusion pressure, which is the goal. We don't want people to start off with no blood flow.
Yep.
Now, I think that on one hand, that's good. Okay, so most people can rate that as a 7, meaning that most people who say it's a 7 out of 10, they have blood flow. Now, the issue is there's a wide range of discrepancies there, meaning that some people will rate that as a very low percentage of their arterial occlusion. Some people are very, very high. So I think that the utility of using that, I think, is still up in the air.
Mm-hmm.
Another way which we've recently started to do is try to make it, relative to the size of the arm. So maybe if you take a percentage of the arm circumference. Now, we have a lot more work to do on that. I don't want to say that that's better than the other method, but I think the point is that it's very difficult. So I think the 7 out of 10, okay, that's one way. Now there's limitations with that. So let's
Mm-hmm.
try maybe a different way. So I think those are two of the more popular ways. But I think it goes to your point of saying it's very difficult. I think the point is for most people with practical restriction is that it doesn't need to be super tight for muscle adaptations. Vascular adaptations, maybe that's something different. But for muscle size, we need a moderate restriction pressure. And I think that that's good news for people who apply practical restriction, because when we use fancy equipment and we apply 40%, 90%, right?
Mm-hmm.
They produce the same adaptations at around 30% 1RM, which is good. Which means when you apply the wraps, if you're getting anywhere in that ballpark, you're going to get probably similar muscle adaptations.
So it
Now,
doesn't have to be exact. Guys, I know a lot of people get so anal and they're emailing me and saying, how do I get this exact,
yeah,
precise, down to the millimeter of mercury? Because if
right.
I don't, it's not going to work. And I'm like, no, it's still going to work. Just like you said, if you're in that range, it's going to be effective.
Now, keeping in mind, like we said, that as you get to higher pressures, it's going to be similar, but you have an augmented cardiovascular response with that, which for most people probably isn't that big of a deal. But
Mm-hmm.
for some people, that could be something to think about.
Yeah, exactly. There's obviously contraindications where it's not appropriate, but if you're a healthy individual or if you've been cleared by your physician to be able to do this form of training, then it shouldn't be an issue.
Sure.
So yeah, so that's really interesting. Have you ever used, one thing I like to use in addition to kind of perceived tightness, which like you said, it has its drawbacks because you have to, you can't standardize that. Perception is going to be variable from individual to individual and even from limb to limb, because some people might think that they're symmetrical, but you have to really have good body awareness to have that symmetry of perceived tightness from limb to limb. One thing I like to use is capillary refill rate, where you press the thumb into the palm of the hand or to the medial aspect of the knee, and you look at how fast the color refills. And they say that if you see the color refill within 2 to 3 seconds, that's kind of the optimal pressure. Have you guys used that before?
We have not, no, but that is interesting.
Yeah, that seems to be an interesting tool to use, just because it is very practical. Anyone can press in the palm of their hand and then count or use a stopwatch or something a little more standardized rather than just perception to see how fast that color refills from the blood flow. So that's interesting. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see some more studies on that particular method.
Yeah.
Do you plan to do more research on the BFR? It sounds like you guys just finished one study. Are you guys going to do more?
Yeah, that's we have a lot of interest. Our interests lie around muscle size and strength, but I would say one of our focuses certainly is blood flow restriction. So we just finished a rather large training study that we're trying to analyze right now as part of 4 different dissertations. So that should be coming out in the next year or so. But yeah, we're always anything related to muscle, but yeah, one of our focuses is always blood flow restriction, certainly.
That's cool. That's great. And another big popular question I get is, where do you wear the wraps if you're going to be training another, body part like chest or back or calves or forearms? If somebody's going to be training something not directly occluded, where do they wear the wraps?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for the lower body, you know, you always put it at the top of the leg. That's just kind of what I think. It's not to say that if you put it above the knee that that's not going to be effective. I think it probably would be effective. I think it's more of a safety thing because there's not as much meat there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's easier to cut off blood flow completely doing that. So I always put it at the same place you would for training the lower body, and the same place you would for training biceps. Meaning that if you're doing the chest, you're still going to apply it right here, right? So now that that brings up the next point. If that's where you're applying it, then how is it augmenting the chest? How could it be augmenting the back? And that's a good question. First, I don't know. I think that the general idea would be the general hypothesis is that you're fatiguing the triceps and the chest is having to pick up the load, right? Or you're fatiguing another muscle in your back's picking up the load. That's the idea. Now there is some data that supports that. Not there's not as much as there is the distal to the cuff, but there is some suggestion that there is proximal growth to the cuff, and that's probably how most people think it's working.
Mm-hmm.
But to say that we have a really good idea of how that's working, I think would be a stretch.
Exactly. Yeah, I've seen bench press studies and other things that kind of show that there is this systemic effect that's happening further than the site of occlusion. It's not just confined to just the biceps and triceps or just the, quads and hamstrings, that it could go further. And I'm a firm believer like you that you should always wear it at the top of the arms or top of the legs. Because you have nerves and different things at the elbows and knees that you probably don't really want to be directly putting a ton of pressure on. So it's probably just a safer bet to just keep wearing it top of the arms or top of the legs.
Right.
So great. Well, yeah, thanks so much today. That's pretty much all my questions I have. Do you have anything else you kind of want to talk about or mention? Got any final thoughts?
No, I think that, one of the things I was excited to hear you say is, kind of a focus on, maybe the nervous system with respect to strength. I think that's kind of an interesting area. I think that how we think about strength changing in response to exercise is something that's been up for discussion in the past couple of years. I think that there's our group in particular has really suggested that this change in muscle size, while maybe it's important for something, probably isn't that important for changing strength. And we've suggested that maybe there's more of this practice component, and maybe that's probably due in part to the nervous system. Maybe there's stuff at the muscle level, but I was excited to hear you kind of say that maybe we should be spending some sort of focus on this nervous system, not only with blood flow restriction, but just in general. So I thought that was a nice point. I think the other point that I always make when I try to do this is that, I'm very thankful that I get to come on these podcasts and get to say all these things, but I have a really solid team around me. My students are really good, and they contribute to a lot of this knowledge and a lot of these ideas. So this is not a one-man show. I work with, Takashi Abe is also working with our lab, but then I have, my 6 PhD students who are all solid. So this is not a one-man show. They all contribute. So I try to give them credit where it's due.
Nice. Awesome. That's great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, and we'll hopefully have you on some more podcasts in the future.
Yeah, it sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.